Well, first of all, I think really the first point is that meditation is something that is natural to human beings. It's not something, to my mind, that is not something we don't know anything about. And I think the further away that we've got from cultures which spend time relaxing in nature, the further away we've got from understanding that meditation is something that is part and parcel of the mind streaming that each one of us has. So I think the first thing is that somebody can recall in their lives a time when they felt extraordinary peace, when their mind was quiet, when their mind was very clear, and when they kind of felt as if they were vibrantly alive and vibrantly awake. And for me, that would take place after all the dishes were done. I came from a family of 6 children, so we were up at the cottage. There was lots of dishes, because it was a hand water pump and water pails from the lake. And so dishes were a big deal. And when they'd be done, I would run for the canoe, and I would pop in the canoe, and I would paddle out. And then I would just drift in the silence and watch the ripples on the water and see the way the sun, as it started to go down, the way the black of the water, because they were Northern Ontario waters, the way the black water would reflect the sunset. And this enormous feeling of open, quiet clarity would come into my being. And as I grew up and entered the working world, and I became a ballet dancer, I was in the National Ballet Company when I was very young, 16. And that world was topsy-turvy and difficult and always so much effort and endeavor. And I would always think to myself, I could just get to the lake, everything will sort out. And it was a long time, it wasn't until I became an actual meditation student that I learned what it was about the lake that was doing that for me. It was the ability to let go. Let go of all the crazy, mixed up, striving, get out of my way thingy that goes on in the world, and just be. And open up to the wonder and the mystery and the majesty of nature. And it was that called me home, back to Canada. It was that part of Northern Ontario, Canadian Shield, that called me home from years and years out of Canada, and years of training and years of teaching and so on. But that's, I think really the underlying point here is not about genealogy, and it's not even about a location, except that I think everybody has a sacred place. And I think once they have a sense of that sacred place, if they can go there in their mind, things begin to settle. And it's certainly well documented that many people die on their way to the cottage in Ontario, or just after they've got there, which causes a lot of problem for the Marines and things. But why? If you ask yourself why, it's because someone who is dying knows if they can return to a place of nature, they can feel part of the rhythm of life and accept it. So if I go back to my childhood, I realized that the seed for what I do now was actually present from a very, very early age. And I remember I used to feel different. In every area that I moved in, I felt a little different. Somehow not quite fitting. And there were a couple of things that really triggered. Somehow I used to, sorry, that's a bit confused. I went to a little school in London, Ontario called Miss Matthews School for Young Ladies. We learned to curtsy, we learned to be very polite, and we learned all the nice things that nice young ladies did in the early 50s. And actually we had a superb education part because the classes were so tiny. But I remember a woman coming, just forgotten her name, but it'll be there in a moment. She was head of the Red Cross. And she came in her army uniform. She wore an army uniform, so it must have been early 50s. And she stood in front of our school assembly in the morning and she gave us a lecture. She didn't say nice, polite things to us. She said, "You people have a responsibility to help the world because you are the rich in the world." And I remember being so taken aback, because here was my dad with 6 children, and there were always grumbles about the bills, and he'd lived through the Depression, and there wasn't any money, and blah, blah, blah. And I thought we were poor. And here's this woman saying, "You are rich. You have to go out and help the world." And I remember that sort of exploding almost inside me. And I guess through growing up, I had this way of being that would try to defend the weak. Because one of my older sisters was being bullied at school. She was 6 years older than I, and I was in junior kindergarten, so I was only 4, and this child was tickling her, and I would have to go up and collect her at lunch to walk me home, which she found very onerous, but anyway. And she was making her life miserable. And apparently I stood up and I pointed my finger at this bully and said, "Don't you touch my sister! Don't you touch my sister!" And she stopped. So somewhere that sort of rescuer thing got going in me awfully early. My mother used to call it my lame ducks. She would call them these, I would bring home other children that were unhappy or upset, and she would call them my lame ducks. And I remember her once saying to me, "It's all very well, Catherine, for you to be bringing home your lame ducks, but just don't marry one." So I guess, you can call it a gene. Certainly my father felt that if you had position in the world, you should use it to help. That's a very old Canadian tradition, people who have a certain level of education. But I think it was also unusual somewhat, even within my own family, I guess, to the extent to which I did this, perhaps. Because many of the others are also in helping professions, many of my sisters. But certainly in the 60s, I was living in Spain in the sort of counterculture of the time. We were tuning in, we were turning on, we were dropping out, we were getting completely fuzzy-brained and full of love and full of silliness, hunting for Sufis around corners and bushes. And somehow it was all going to magically come right. All you need, the record, Sgt. Pepper came out at the same time. All you need is love. And in some ways that's the message I'm still teaching. Because once you have that, everything changes in the world, everything. That journey through the fuzziness of the 60s and moving up to England at the end of the 60s, I retrained from ballet, I became a modern dancer, I worked in alternate theatre in the 60s. It was a lovely time, fascinating time to be in London. We were going to save the world, It didn't work, but we thought we were going to save the world. I started a Notting Hill Arts and Community Centre for street kids at a time when Notting Hill was a very poor district. Then I got pregnant with my eldest son. And so we were sort of halfway into the mystical world, but it was all kind of fuzzy and confused. And following the birth of my eldest son, I had so many inner experiences arise. There was no question any longer in my mind about, did I need a teacher? Did I need some teaching? Because I knew some of what was arising in the mind was opening, because I'd read enough by then, but also some of what was arising was just nuts. It was just unbalanced, out of place stuff. So as soon as I returned to Canada, which was October 1969, the end of October, November the 10th, 1969, I went to or maybe it was the 9th, the first Dharma class. And there was a Buddhist monk detailing in English many of the experiences I had and talking about them as if they were chronological, as if they were orderly, as if they opened new layers of understanding. And all of a sudden there was a framework into which I could place at least some of what I'd experienced. So I remember distinctly thinking, well, I don't know about these people because I think they're pretty strange, and I don't know about this Buddhism stuff because after all, I wanted to find a Sufi teacher because they sing and they dance, right? but I need to know what that man knows. And so that was my beginning in my training as a Buddhist. I had, in the years following the ballet company, I had gone to University of Toronto and taken a degree in English at Trinity College. So at that time we also studied religious knowledge. So I'd also been moderately immersed in Christian study and had been, since the age of about 16, very strongly attached, curious, and interested in the Christian motif. So I don't find now that that's not part of me. It's very much part of me. Because I really do think that all religions are speaking one truth. We have different ways to go about it. So the Buddhist path for me was a bit of a struggle because it didn't contain the sort of singing, dancing part of me. However, the teacher I had was eclectic enough. He was also a Westerner. It was very unusual at that time. He was eclectic enough that he did some movement work, and he did talk about Rumi, and he talked a bit about Western work and so on, Western philosophy. So it was the right accident. I took it very seriously because I was in a very confused, anxious state of mind. So anxious that at first I couldn't sit still to practice. Clearly that doesn't manifest now. So it was just like the old text says, you grab the Dharma like a raft because you're drowning in the river. It is the raft that carries you to the other shore. So in 1972, following the birth of my second son, in 1972, my husband and I and our two children sold up, gave away everything we owned, and left for the Far East to get enlightened. Following this teacher, we went to Morocco. We did 6 months of every known form of psychotherapy. And then we went on to India and took initiation from the Tibetans. But already by then, all the Karmatindi Rinpoche's pictures up there had come through Toronto, and I'd connected with them a lot. And this sense of not knowing what to ask or even how to ask it, but knowing this sense that this somehow was a streaming that called to me. And over the years I've learned that it's an extraordinarily skillful way of developing all the different strands of mind. Did I feel a little different in each grouping in the Buddhist group I was in? Yes, I guess I did, because of these other parts of me. I also was a dedicated, committed mom, and that's not the traditional Buddhist pathway. So I dragged my two sons through a lot. Temples, the backs of temples in India, bad hotel rooms with rats on the floor, difficult nannies in Morocco made them ill by giving them unboiled water. A lot of things for which, thank God, they've forgiven me. Camping with two babies in diapers in Africa. In a VW van, that kind of stuff, following the bhikkhu, following the teacher. A lot of the way he trained people was taking them traveling. So clearly at a certain point I couldn't keep doing that with two children. So when we landed in New Zealand in 1973, we landed with $10, a black box full of old canned goods from Tanzania, two babies in diapers, and no jobs. So we stayed. And I stayed there for almost 7 years. And leaving from time to time for courses, setting up a dance school there, eventually after 1976 attending a teacher training program, being given to start teaching people, and that's what I did. There was a time in New Zealand, I still have contacts and students and occasionally visit there still. But I needed to go home at a certain point. So I left. My two sons and I came home. And it was an extraordinary year. I was able to teach at the University of Western Ontario in the dance department, continuing ed dance faculty. And I was with my mom for a year, and it turned out to be the last year of her life. And that, in fact, was a great gift, because it enabled me to be with her and for her to get to know her grandsons. And that's when I met my second husband, and again by accident we moved back to Toronto, which was the last place. I was never coming to live in the city again, and certainly not in Toronto again, but here we were. So I started teaching here, first in my living room, way, whoever came by, asked for help. If I can help, I help. And slowly it built into this, where I've trained now 8 people to teach, if they wish to teach, and there's a terrific amount of teaching energy and student energy now at Friends of the Heart, and a wonderful help, I think, to the community, because of its non-sectarian nature, because we're trying to live up to our name, Friends of the Heart. It is a little different to a traditional Buddhist center because we're all householders. So the idea of not leaving, the Theravada path tends to be, or has been, and I think it's altering now a lot, particularly as Buddhist teaching comes to the West. But there was an emphasis on leaving one's family and taking up the single celibate life in order to obtain awakening. And there was a certain place, certainly in 1979, as I left New Zealand and returned home, where it was a very, very clear rotation within me that I was striking out on a pathway that was not the total, complete, traditional Theravada past. And I think that's one of the reasons I find some comfort in the Vajrayana system, because women are considered capable of awakening in that system. And there are female formations, Tara, for instance, who is a fully awakened female form. There are also some married lineages, and although the teachers tend to be male, there is also one line of Maccafilms that is held somewhat by the Shampa Kargyu, by Kala Rinpoche's people. I don't know, I have not had a great deal of teaching in it, but I know when I do her practice, which I have received, it's sort of like coming home. It kind of puts all of the training I've had together and puts it in place, because it is all about clarity, emptiness, and openness, and offering all of yourself to help all beings. The possibility that exists of always learning also fascinates me. And this phrase in the Western mystery training says, how do you know it's a door?
Right.
And the respondent, the aspirant, says, by the resistance. So sometimes a doorway is put in front of us,
right,
to see if we'll walk through it.
right,
And it looks like resistance. And if you are just straight, the way I feel has got to be right. In other words, equating feeling and intuition. And you can make that mistake.
Interesting.
You can think, oh, that makes me feel anxious, so I shouldn't, that's not for me.
Right.
Where in fact what you may be feeling, and particularly the more illumined the teacher is, the more whatever it is that blockades us from the light will start to come up immediately in their presence.
Right.
So that can't be the only criteria.
Right.
You need to test it out longer than that. And Jack Cornfield's written some really good stuff in Path with Heart on how to look at a group and look at a teacher, and it's not just the teacher, it's also the way a group interacts, and
right.
What their attitude is to the teacher, whether challenge is possible. I remember reading through that as we were developing our codes of conduct for teachers, which we have here, which is somewhat unusual. And we were trying to establish, not because we've had the problems that have arisen in other groups, but because we didn't want to have them. And that's one reason that I agreed to have a public face at all, because I don't particularly care whether I have 2, 10, or 50 people in front of me. But it was, we need to have a code, not just for students, but a code for teachers so that anybody who comes here feels absolutely safe.
All right.
And has a way of being able to be in the space and know that they will not be impinged on, they will not be abused in any way.
Right.
And one of the things that we were looking at was the work that Cornfield has done in that area, which is excellent. And in some of his work, he was talking about how to judge teachers and how to relate to it. And one of the things I remember standing out at the time was I'd done everything else except this one thing that said, see what if the teacher is allowing the advanced students to move up. Because a lot of the early teachers coming out here were sort of the singleton method, you know.
Right.
I'm the great awakened individual, you should all follow me. Right? And we did, you know, little rabbits, do. And it wasn't until later that you saw the bumps in the road and the barnacles on the person, and you began to develop some assessment tools. We were naive, innocent. But when I saw that, I thought, okay, I haven't done that well enough yet. So that really started a whole move of trying to bring the senior students into positions where they tried teaching for a while. They weren't necessarily drawing people, me coming into the classes, watching them, trying to help them establish themselves, so that there became another layer starting to come up. And in a sense, we're just starting in a way with the third layer coming up. And it's resulting in not exact replicas, not at all, because that would be idiotic.
Right.
But in each unique individual coming forward with their own strengths, their own talents, and feeling supported to do that. So I'm really grateful to his work, because it's Friends of the Heart's is crucible now, I think, for beings who are of good heart and good experience and doing their work.
Right.
I've taught for more than 30 years, 1976 I started teaching, so many students. So I'll start with a quote from my husband. He's a professor of technology, radio and television arts, especially his documentary. So he's a technological man. He's a wonderful man. One of his colleagues said, trying to puzzle out why I was married to this strange person called a meditation teacher, what is it, do you think, that Catherine does with her students? And my husband's response was, well, I'm not entirely sure, but here's what I see. I see them come in pretty anxious, not happy, and pretty confused. And after a few years, I often see them go confident, calm, and ready to take on their lives. Now, he was speaking at a time when I was mostly teaching at York University, so the bulk of the student body somehow was younger. Even in my private classes, they seemed to be younger. They weren't necessarily the York students, but there was just a general, more youthful people, more people in their 20s. That didn't mean I didn't have ones in their 60s and even 80s. So I've taught people as young as 5 or 6, and I've taught people as old as in their 80s. But at this particular time, they were mostly in their 20s. So sometimes the only work that I might do with someone is giving them the confidence and the skill, the study skills, the confidence, the balance, and the encouragement, the support, to become successful in the outer world. And there have been a number of occasions when, having achieved that, I've thought to myself, now we can really begin the work of awakening. And they go. And that used to disappoint me a bit, but over time I see that that is an immensely valid and valuable function of meditation study if it can help us clarify mind, feel supported in our work, and develop the confidence and the skill to move ahead. Then this is a great service. The work of awakening into deeper layers of consciousness and more luminous understandings takes longer. It takes longer than just being functionally capable in the world. To that end, I established, when we first moved here 8 years ago, I established an intensive meditative program to directly address exactly that. So it's very individual, but it also has commonality in the way that it trains people to create a really strong foundation, to clear away the cobwebs of mind, the things that prevent the light from shining, because intrinsic to the Buddhist view is that we're already awakened, and we just are confused and conditioned. And we need to clear those clouds of confusion and conditioning so that we stop being reactive in the world and begin to be able to be, as Thich Han says, 100% present for another. So what I've seen over time is people, both in the training and in all the years I've taught, people who have come from terrible depressed states, high anxiety states, people even with quite demolished and fragmented mind states, learn how to knit the mind together. The fact that I had to learn that myself is why I've been able to help others do that. Learn how to walk in the world. And for those who move into deeper training, to learn how pathway opens. And one of the things that holds me, in a sense, to the Buddhist path is how clear and logical it is, how the stepping stones are very, very clearly laid out. And it may exist in other forms of training, but this is the training I have, and I know it's very secure. If people will do this foundation work, the Tibetan foundation work, if they will follow these stepping stones, the awakened mind begins to shine more and more through them. And over time I've seen amazing things. Amazing things. So I'll tell you one amazing story.
Great.
I had this student who came from a very rigid evangelistic family, evangelistic Christian family. And so she would sneak into my classes. And slowly over time, as she began to work, she was terribly depressed. She arrived with, it was the time of the Goths, so she would arrive with all this white makeup on and these black rings around her eyes and all sorts of tattoos and all sorts of rings and things in various places. And for weeks she was a friend of hers was trying to bring her to the class. She would sit outside on the doorstep. She wouldn't even come in. Finally she began to come in, and finally she began to work with me. And as we began to work, I was afraid for a while that I might have crosses burning on my front lawn, because I knew that any entry into Buddhist thought was very antipathetic to her family. However, we started. She wanted it. Her parents were stink, and she wasn't having anything to do with them, and all grown-ups were awful, and blah, blah, blah. Over time, she began to change. The training of her had to be quite strict, to give her really strict boundaries, so that she would turn up and she would do the practice. And as time went on, the makeup came off, the earrings fell away, the clothing started to change, this woman started to open up and soften. And then we would talk about her family, and there was absolutely no way that she should go home and try and convince her family this was helpful, because it would just have caused tremendous distress. So I said, just don't do that at all. Just do your own work. And over time, the whole family started to change and heal. It was just wonderful to watch. And I've seen that in a number of times where if the person will take up the work over time, what we call it the mandala of the family, the whole circle of the family will start to shift, the dynamic will start to change, and tremendous healing can take place. And it doesn't take place because somebody goes out to convert somebody else. It takes place because we bring the work home, and we bring it here, and make the change here. When I was very young, as a teacher and had tons of energy, I remember having a young woman check herself out of a mental hospital in New Zealand to come to a course. And at the end of the course, she did very well. At the end of the course, I had nowhere to have her go to stay, so I brought her home to our house. And she was significantly depressed, and I remember having to stand over her each morning and say, okay, you have to get up out of the bed. She is now living she lives in Australia. She has a wonderful marriage, a wonderful son, a wonderful life, and that time gave her a roadway out. I would never ever encourage anybody to go off medication, for instance, if they're on medication. And so over time I've worked with any number of people who are on medication from a doctor, and so work in conjunction with a doctor if it becomes feasible to slowly reduce the medication. So it's not a question of jumping out of the ordinary medical field at all. We have to honor all sides, and it's amazing that we have the medical help that we have. Knowledge yet as a culture is how interdependently engaged we are. How what we do, this healing I was talking about the woman with the very strict evangelistic family that would have been very against her studying with me if they'd known for a while. Eventually, of course, they did know. But for the first period, they would have been horrified and very, very angry about it. And what we don't acknowledge yet as a culture, and this is the reach of this is huge, is that everything that we do affects everything around us, and that we are interacting at a molecular level, at a psychological level, and at a spiritual level with everything around us and with the world as a whole. If we really understood that, and particle physics shows it in a lab, but it's very difficult to show in a world as complex as ours, if we really, really understood that, we would change radically the way the world is moving. And the healing of this young woman that took place over time in her life, healing her family, is part of that interdependent arising. So it gives me hope at times that that doing this work one heart at a time is what can possibly change the world, and that we need to take it up. It's why so many people who do meditation work are involved in ecological activity, in environmental work, because they begin to see that. The deeper you see that, the more profound you understand that, the more you realize that you have to clean this up and you have to keep this on track all the time, because if you don't, the interdependent arising that will fall out of that is going to be negative, that there will be an impact. And I watch it now all the time. It happens both, but it's happening at a level that is really quite remarkable. So So I come from a family of six women, 6 girls. 3 of us, the 3 eldest, have had breast cancer. And it's almost 3 years ago to the day that my younger sister died of metastatic breast cancer. And I was lucky enough to be with her the last month and to be present at her death and to be with her and her family. My older sister was diagnosed just a year after my younger sister. She's still living, although she had a very advanced cancer, but in a different place to my younger sister. My older sister had the cancer out close to the nipple, therefore less connected to the bone, and my younger sister was pretty much right against the bone. So by the time they got the primary, it had already moved. 2 years ago, almost a year after my sister's death, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, 2 different types of breast cancer, one in each breast, simultaneously blossoming, both invasive, therefore quite aggressive form. So I opted for a very fierce regimen of Western medicine. Lost my hair, got back curly hair. It's the permanent. The only upside is you're get a new updo. Either that or it's an experience so bad it curls your hair, right? You know, but anyway. I don't know whether that's permanent or not, but at the moment it seems to be. There are, since that time I've met with and talked with a number of people with cancer, and of course explored my own journey, because it is a journey. It becomes a lifetime event, it's not a death sentence, it's a life sentence. You begin to live and reassess and live differently. And as I said about Vajrayana, the great blessing of it is that each moment is a moment of learning, not of denying. So what is it that one looks at? One looks at everything. You can't afford to not look at everything. So there are physiological events that go on. There are psychological events. There are emotional events, and there are spiritual events. And all of these need healing if one is to heal any serious illness. The year before my cancer diagnosis, I knew it was very close. I could see it in my energy body flickering. I could feel that something was not right in the subtle bodies within. And they'd been watching one lump, we'll just take a few extra pictures, dear, every year for a number of years. And I allowed that to go on because life was very busy, and life is busy, and the year before the actual diagnosis was a year where a lot of things happened. A lot of immediate proximate causes took place, all of which placed stresses on the body and on physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual. All of them were present in that year before. All of that eventually gets to a point where your immune system can't hold on any longer, and it simply manifests a disease. Why it manifests one disease over another disease? Because I'm kind of an A personality type. I thought maybe I'd be more like a heart attack type. Why it manifests one as opposed to the other means that there are certain weaknesses in each of our systems that are going to, under correct conditions, when all the conditions come together, they're going to manifest. So clearly, probably for environmental reasons, certainly not anything else that my family can track, there was something took place in the early environment. And we think we know what it is, but you have to deal with what you deal with. There was a certain poisoning of our ponds and fields and things that took place when we were young. But my dad was convinced we were carcinogenic, but he took the company to court and he lost the case because it was the 50s. And, okay. It's not genetic. We've had the testing as far as they know. There's nothing genetic. So what you're left with is an environment. So you can either start getting really angry, or you can start meeting what has arisen with attention to all those four levels: physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual. And if you do take that approach, and that's the wonderful thing about the Buddhist philosophy, it says the only place that peace is to be found is right in this moment. The only place of nirvana is just this moment, just this breath, just this time. And it enables you to then walk to meet whatever is arising in the life with joy and interest. And so it becomes a fascinating journey. I mean, yeah, it's a journey you don't wish on somebody, but it's a journey of interest and therefore potential to open our hearts deeper, just like the breaking of a love affair. You know, everybody's had a broken love affair at some point or another. And if they look back on that time, they'll probably find how much they grew, if they grew out of it. So the philosophy of the Buddhist view is a tremendous asset. And the practices of the techniques of Buddhist meditation, of breathing in, breathing out, letting go, letting the heart mind open, coming to be present in the present moment, all that work comes rising up to support you at that time. Then there's the interdependent arising of what happens with people you interact with and the people around you. Now the Tibetans traditionally make quite a big, and now palliative care in general, is moving into understanding that the time of death is quite important to make an environment for the dying person into a very wholesome place. And palliative care has moved enormously to help people come into a place of peace and presence, when they die. So too, the modality of healing is terribly important to approach in the same way. And the idea that's still, occasionally being taught out there, which is that cancer is the enemy, and develop the attitude that these are Pac-Men running through your system, and this is a battle, is very counterproductive to that journey. And certainly I've had one person phone me and start to become my student because of that. Because she said, I can't do this. They want me to have a battle inside me, and it just feels all wrong. So what else can I do? And from there we started. And for 16 years she lived with metastatic cancer and developed spiritually tremendously. And though she died of the cancer, she died healed as a person. And in the process healed her family and became a very wise woman. So serious illness can produce this great opportunity for us to work at all of these levels. And personally, I've been tremendously helped, very palpably helped, when the Friends of the Heart group has sat here and meditated for my well-being. And tremendous shifts, I can feel tremendous shifts take place within the subtle bodies. And because of all the work I've done, I can tell when cancer's starting to become active, and I could track each session of chemo as it went through, how it began to work in different areas, almost as if the cancerous cells were trying to find places to lodge. And so one area after another with each of the chemo treatments would really felt like they became huge and very red hot. So one time it was the liver, and one time it was an area of the bones, and one time so on, that sort of stuff. So I'm left with a continuing medication that I take that supposedly discourages the formation of tumors, and the hope is that they will then forget how to produce the tumors over the period that you take the medication. I'm left using Western medicine, but um, also very, very cognizant that that is not the only thing that one should use in treating cancer, and that helping myself to change my lifestyle, helping myself by psychologically with certain levels of support and certain kinds of activity, which for me actually are letting go of being so disciplined and becoming maybe a little more frivolous, taking time off, right? Actually, I call myself the lazy Lama now. Take time off. And that's, for somebody as disciplined as I am for so many years, first with dance and now with meditation, is paradoxically kind of difficult. Nourishing myself spiritually by doing my practice and by being with spiritual friends like I find here, and connecting with that what I was talking about, that elemental balance, and the sense that the universe is immensely merciful and supportive, and using the prayer to use each moment and each day to help to bring compassion, clarity into being. Throughout the active period of illness, serious illness, can turn people quite narcissistic because in a way you have to focus on yourself, and many people who develop cancer are what Riesman used to call other-directed rather than inner-directed. They're always the helpers. Never mind what some of the pop things is. Have you got anger that you haven't expressed yet? No. Maybe some people do, and maybe they need to explore that, but that wasn't the case in my case. I'm quite good at that. So that wasn't there. Well, it's all food created, somebody else will say. If you just correct your diet, well, sorry, I've been a whole grain brown rice or lots of vegetables, fruits, and no packaged foods since the 1960s, so we can't go there. Well, if you're psychologically repressing a lot of things, I don't think so. Are you over busy? Yes. Has the interdependent arising from the year before the cancer fruited been a factor? Yes. So I must then unpick each one of those layers: psychological, emotional, spiritual, and activity. And for this person, it means a lot cooling out the activity. Back to more Waitara, a little less of the dancing bikini. And what I receive from prayers that are done on my behalf is enormous changing. And unprovable, completely unprovable. But here's a little scrap of interest on the magic level. Between the diagnosis and the surgery, the tumors were diagnosed at a certain size. Upon surgery, they were seen to have gone down substantively. They were smaller. They were very close to the margins. That means they were very close to really breaking into the system. My experience in several of the meditations that were done here on my behalf, group meditations, bless their hearts, was that I could actually feel the lumps shrinking during the meditation practices. So I was not surprised at all when the surgeon said to me, well, it was interesting because the lumps were smaller by X amount. And I said, well, that's interesting. And I dared to say, well, here's my experience where it was. Or maybe I just said, why was that? I said, well, and that happens, that happens when, between the way we measure them and the biopsies and the way they are. So in other words, that disappeared from view because from a Western medical perspective, that is not yet where Western medical thinking can go. It's still working from the pathological end of things. That here is a diseased organ, and the science has shown it to be this size, and therefore you remove it, and therefore the system will heal. The other end, which is that the system is malleable and open, and if you work on all these various layers, there is a potential to change the karmic weaving, the way in which conditions are knitted together, and therefore in the way in which the life will go forward. So, do I hope for a longer life that is cancer-free with a return of good energy so I can continue to help beings? Yes, of course I do. Every plant wants to continue to live. If it arises again, will I try to meet it with all the faculties I have at my disposal, including being grateful for being in the Western world where such medicine is available? Yes, I will. Do I think of it with anger? No. If anything, there's gratitude and interest. And sometimes I'm a bit stunned. Sometimes, occasionally, I'll wake in the morning and I think, my goodness, I had cancer. How did that happen? But in fact, I know how to. So it's fine. You know, human beings are finite. We're not meant to live forever. We have bodies that, we hope, of course we hope they will go on for a while. It takes a very long time to ripen spiritual wisdom. I just feel as if it's only now ripened after almost 40 years of work. Do I want that to sustain so it will reach out? Yes. Would I like to see, hopefully my children might have grandchildren, have children? Of course. But do I have the ability to move with it as my sister did into death? What a blessing. Teaching I've had, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, teaches us how to walk into death and what to do. It's a tremendous offering. And I was so interested when she was dying that the Western observation of the process of death, which has certain stages that they document, are exactly the same as the way that the Tibetans have documented the walk of the body into death. Exactly the same. They're different words. One is more mythological in the way it speaks of it. Clearly the Western approach is very oriented to function, body function, but the Tibetan practice is also function-oriented, but it is speaking of it in terms of the way the consciousness is shifting. And so it's an enormous jewel of training for that level of life, because after all, it's an experience that we're all going to meet. And the training in that actually begins with the elements. It begins with watching how you fall asleep and watching how you wake up. So it's available to all of us. The mind of light is called enlightenment. In this we take refuge. The body of truth is called the Dharma. In this we find solace. The teachers of truth are called the Sangha, and in them we find comfort and courage. Our minds are not separate from the mind of enlightenment. Let us vow to sweep away its cobwebs. Our knowledge can grow to be an exhibition of truth. Let us vow to burnish our awareness. Our bodies are storehouses for learning and development. We vow to treat them with honor and kindness. The energy of breath rising is the energy of growth. The energy of breath falling is the energy of return. The midpoint of balance is that place of union where body, speech, and mind join together, and the jump to transcendent wisdom becomes possible. In all this, we take refuge. Sonje chodon su chi cho nam nam, chanchu bardu dagni chab so chi, dagi jin su chi pe so nam ke, rola penshir sonje ru pa shu. Sonje chodon su chi cho nam nam, chanchu bardu dagni chab so chi, dagi jin su chi pe so nam ke, rola penshir sonje ru pa shu. Sonje chodon su chi cho nam nam, chanchu bardu dagni chab so chi, dagi jin su chi pe so nam ke, rola penshir sonje ru pa shu. With the wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the presence of the Buddhas, I generate the mind for full awakening for the sake of all sentient beings. As long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the mysteries